Okay, any questions? Any initial questions anybody have? Oh, hello, Professor. How are you? Nice to see you. I mean, some of you also may be Professor. But how are you? I'm always in a good mood because I like them. And we have to come after a Ashoka, because Ashoka is the one that sort of spread the Sangha community all over India. And even the symbolic legend goes to the four recreational structures, which are the hairs, the giant fists, the relics of Lady, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment, and Sarnath, where he taught the wheel of Dharma in those four stupas. And supposedly the emperor, he broke open those stupas, he took out the relics, and he diluted them. And you know, religious fanatics do this. They take some dust from some dead saint or some bone relic or something, and then they add sand, and they get like a barrel full, and then they put it all around. You know, so it's still very potent. And so then he's supposed to build 84,000 stupas all over India, which is clearly a symbolic number. But he was really responsible for that. And actually, he gave his whole empire to the Sangha, symbolically. That's that part of his legend, and who knows if it really happened. But the story was that the ministers, when he was quite elderly, his ministers locked him up because they knew he wanted to make a greater gift to the Sangha than anybody ever had in history. So that he was a danger, he would give away everything. And before he died, and so they had him locked up, and no paper, and you know, controlling what went in and out of the room. So apparently he took mango skin and he hid it and it dried, and then on the mango skin with his own blood and some broken piece of wood or something, he wrote, you know, I, the Emperor Ashoka of all of Bharata, Maurya Empire, I hereby donate to the Sangha all the entire territory under my control, you know, the entire, not all, it wasn't all of it now it's the Indian subcontinent, but it was huge. And then he whispered, or he shouted out a window at some passing monk, and he threw this mango skin out the window from his palace to the passing monk. So the passing monk, and then he said, go take that to Upagupta. Upagupta was the head of the order at that time. And so then Upagupta got that document where they owned the entire Indian Sangha. And he quickly ran back to the ministers and he said, oh, that's all right. You know, it's a nice gesture, but that's okay. We'll sell it back to you for a modest price. And so then the state made a modest donation and they got back the title to the entirety of India. So that's part of the legend of Ashoka, but it's kind of nice. And he sort of intended to give it all away. So that's nice that he did, since generosity is a major virtue. So then, naturally, around that time, we have the emergence, what's known as the emergence of the Mahayana. And you've been reading in different history books and in different things in your sources. In the CHCA book, I think you read that at the end of last week about the formation of empires. Throughout Eurasia as a sort of a next social stage. And then the rise of Mahayana is associated with that in India, and then pretty soon later after that in China, it starts to go there to the Chinese Empire. And that's what they say. And then the fact that then they have a very irrational thesis, which the historicist Western scholars tend to have about Buddhism in the study of Asian religions in general, and Buddhism in particular, since it's all over Asia. And that is that, well, the Buddhist monks by this time were becoming very unpopular. Because, well, naturally they were monks. And so they get kind of unpopular. They're boring, they tell people you can't have fun, don't do anything, just meditate, stay enlightenment. And after all, you're suffering all the time, so there's no fun. And so therefore they naturally became unpopular. And around this time, about 400 or 500 years after Buddha's time, the Hinduism was coming on strong with what's called bhakti. You know? In other words, the old Vedic gods who didn't love you and you didn't love them either. You placated them with a sacrifice through the ritual, which we discussed very, very briefly in other earlier lectures. And you sort of were afraid of them, in other words. They were like fearsome types. And again, that Tambaya book that I have been referring to a number of recent lectures, you know, you were also afraid of the ideal Hindu king who had the divine right of kings and who could punish anybody with the danda, you know, with the rod of punishment, and could take anyone's life that he wanted to, you know, because he would sort of make any war or do anything. He was exempt from normal ethics, but he was implementing the sort of social ethic that was there. And then you begin to have after Ashoka, and he seems to be the one who starts it. Rather impractically, some of the historians say the idea that the king is the servant and loves his people, you know, rather than the king keeps them in line with fear and terror. You know, which are two different theories of kingship, right? And so all this happens around that time, and then the Buddhists, they're feeling all left out and unpopular. Nobody likes the monks anymore. So they decide they're going to make up they're going to divinize the Buddha. They're going to make the Buddha into a deity to compete with the Hindu deities. And then they're going to have bodhisattvas who love you also. The Buddha loves you now suddenly, instead of telling you that it's no fun and you just have to like annihilate yourself in some sort of dualistic notion of nirvana is outside the world. And instead he loves you, and there's non-dual, and nirvana is here if you understand it, and so on. And then the bodhisattva is there to become a Buddha out of the love of all beings. So this is just, they make all this up, and they pretend Buddha taught it in order to compete with devotionalistic Hinduism. This is the way it's taught, actually. And then the different parts of it emerge in different centuries at different times. So maybe the early ones are still kind of boring, the Prajnaparamita ones about emptiness. So, because that's kind of in the line of the suffering, it's all empty, you know. And all these scholars think emptiness is nothingness, you know. And actually, as many Western Buddhists do, they think that emptiness is the Buddhist discovery of the materialist nothingness that surrounds life and to which we all return when we die, according to the because we don't have a soul and we don't have a consciousness. And Buddhists say there's no soul. Oh, they were just they were preempting Carl Sagan and all the materialist scientists, Darwin, etc. That it's all just a material process, either biological or physical. So that's their story about it, which has a number of holes in it. If the Buddhists were, at the time that he's talking about, were so unpopular, and the thing that was really hot was devotionalism, Hindu devotionalism, they can just become Hindus. Why don't they drag out the unpopular Buddha, who's like the boring, and monks are boring, so they don't need to be monks. They can all be lay people, and they can go out and try to compete for popularity with the Hindus. It's so silly of them to try to connect to Buddhism. Makes no sense at all. In India, even today, there are a number of living gods in India, and India has a lot of piety, and so it's not that difficult to start a new religion in India, actually. And the missionaries have a good time when they go there, and the Indian culture is like that, and apparently it always has been. So I don't agree with that story, and I'm telling it in a different way. And my story is that as Buddha wished to do, he wanted to establish the monastic, he wanted to do what I call the Swiss cheesification of Indian society, which means that when you have a unitary or monistic society, which I think I talked to you about, the cosmic egg, and then people think the reason they learn religion is that the gods are powerful, the ancestors are powerful, and they want to be prosperous and successful and so forth, and then they do a lot of rituals and offerings to the gods. And the idea is that then they can rise to the happy hunting ground, or whatever more elaborate version of a happy hunting ground, after death, and become an ancestor and have subsequent generations make offerings to them. And there's no notion in that of liberation, and it's really not very individualistic. You do what your father did, you do what your mother did if you're a woman, and this patriarchal thing, the Vedas enforcing it, and the king enforcing it, and the Brahmin priests enforcing it, and that's what you do. And so the monastic thing, and the idea that you as an individual, symbolized by Buddha's leaving the palace upsetting his wife, upsetting his son, upsetting his father, upsetting everybody apparently, even his horse. And he goes off to do something as an individual. And then lots of people do that. And they drop out, and they're tolerated apparently to drop out for the most part. And in huge numbers they do. And it becomes, by the time of 200 years later, the time of Ashoka, 200-300 years later, it's a completely established institution. And no one can assault it, kind of thing. But it sort of leaves intact the lay society during that period. Because like this, and Tambaya talks about how, related to that sutra of the beginning that you read last week, sutta of the beginning in Pali, there's this new idea of kingship, there's this new idea of a more ideal community from which human beings deteriorated, and they had police to keep each other apart and so forth, not to rob from each other and so on. And they become so entrenched that the kings have to allow these unnecessary people to kind of sit there and do their thing, you know, and nuns too escaped. Still strong nunneries were going on for around 400 years later. And so then they're in a position of strength, in other words. The Buddhist institution is strong. It's far from being unpopular, they're popular. And we see from Ashoka these huge stupas that were the few things. A tremendous amount of the physical remains of that were destroyed because when the Muslims came in at the end of the first millennium, Common Era, they have this thing about aniconic, you know, you shouldn't have human form, you shouldn't have, even animals are dangerous, golden calf, you know. They're trying to be more Jewish than the guy with the triple bar mitzvah. And they're therefore very aniconic, you know, no icons, no idols, you know. And so they wreck everything, and there's not a single painting, like a canvas painting, and there were what they call pata, like what we now call Tibetan tankas, but there must have been zillions of them in India. There were a few sort of caves in isolated places where you could still see the painting from these early eras. Ajanta is the most amazing one. But mostly they destroyed everything, so you don't have that much physical evidence. But what you do have, these big stupas, and then the few things that the Brits began to dig up that were lucky enough to be sort of remote or buried. And then when the Brits came, after a while, they sort of found this, what is this, who's Buddha? And nobody could really tell them, well, Buddha is God. Well, no, we don't know. And the Brits actually thought Buddha was from Africa because they had that little curly hair, so they thought he was from Africa and came to Sri Lanka. And the religion came from Africa. They didn't think that. They didn't think it was connected initially to Chinese Mahayana thing, because they didn't know much about China or Japan, this kind of thing, in that period. So, so then you can see that there was a huge physical. All of the famous, what are called the Hindu mutts nowadays, where the four Shankaracharyas dwell in the sort of mainstream of Hinduism, all of them were sites of Buddhist monasteries in the past. The Hindus didn't have monks. It was against the, you know, the four stages of life in conventional Hinduism. You know, you were a student, and then you were a householder, then you were a forest retreatant and retiree, and then you became a wandering sannyasin, what they call, which means you sort of divested of all your property and you went around wandering, being holy until you died. And so in those four, the celibacy, essential element of monasticism, was allowed for the student, in fact recommended for the student. But once a householder, then that means marriage and progeny, and then you're contributing to the society in that way. And so only when Buddhism began to be weakened by incursions by foreigners and by Brahmin kings needing to fight them off, did they begin to allow the Hindus themselves start doing lifelong celibacy. But you know, your swamis, what they call swamis, so but they didn't do that until the Buddhist thing. And the Jains never were that big because they were in the cities and they were very wealthy, but they were never that strong socially. So the point is, Ashoka and this sort of whole Buddhist idea about the individual and about wisdom, and then the compassion that is taught. The key element of Mahayana is the compassion element. And the compassion element is taught in the Theravada form and the other sects of the dualistic or individual vehicle Buddhism. The compassion is taught by Buddha saying, well, I had to be a monkey king, I had all the Jatakas. where the Buddha self-sacrifices. You know, he gives away everything. He gives his life, his mind, his body, his blood, his eyes, his family. And he does all these very virtuous and altruistic things. But he never says to the monks particularly, except insofar as they teach other beings how to liberate themselves. But other than that, he doesn't teach them that they really have to cultivate compassion, and that the enlightened condition is a condition where you give back, in a sense, because you have become one with all the beings. So therefore, you become your responsibility. You know, these guys, the individual vehicle people, don't want to hear about that. They don't want to be responsible for everybody because they think there's nothing much you can do for them, the way they understand it. And they know that Buddha is special, and he has a special power and charisma and effectiveness in mobilizing people, but they don't necessarily think they can do that. All they want to do is be arhats and escape. And in a way, that's kind to people because their natural selfishness they have overcome, and then they enjoy the fruit of that by disappearing in a nirvana thought of as apart from the world. So you know, there's a sort of, you can make a diagram, and you have nirvana up here in the individual vehicle, what we've been studying so far, and you have samsara here. And the idea is you go out of samsara into nirvana via wisdom. And wisdom means knowing the nature of reality. And what you know is that this samsara is constructed based on ignorance, and when you have knowledge to counter that, you then know that the true reality is nirvana, but you imagine that nirvana is elsewhere. And so you have an experience as if you disappear and everything disappears, which seems to you like a big reality. You then come out of that experience because you're still human, and they have in the Sri Lanka, for example, in their literature, they have like analogies like, it's like you switch off a fan in a room, like you switch off the circuit of electric power to it, but the fan keeps whirling for a while, and then it stops. It doesn't stop instantly when you switch it off. So then they think I came back and I'm here in a body, me Shariputra, me Mahakasyapa, Ananda, whoever it is, and then, but when I pass away from the body, that's when the fan stops, and then I'm in nirvana, which was that state that I found, which was outside of the world, where nobody else was there. But at least, and I didn't therefore, I wasn't able to really help others, but I felt a kind of wonderful peace and calm apart from everything, and they too can, and also I'm no longer egotistical, so I won't be harmful to them, so that's also good. So, but it's not like I'm going to become a being that is capable of helping everybody else, you know, forever, type of thing. That would not be a good definition. Because they are tired of having to do that, and and I think most of the disciples that Buddha intended were the male elite, either priest or warrior, who were the ones who dominate other people and are violent, and they make wars and they do things, and he's the one who was trying to calm down. And actually that picture, he was very careful to say, as I told you, that nirvana, remember the four formless states, that's why I told you about those right away. I wanted to impress them on your mind, the four formless states. Because those four formless states are kind of states of being completely apart from everything. And apart from your own body, even. You know, and the idea that those are higher reality. But then Buddha carefully said, those are not nirvana. But you know, they kind of didn't listen because they were so desperate to get away. They were so sensitive, escapist. You know, they were men. They didn't want to get in the kitchen. They didn't want to deal with childbirth. They didn't want to deal with the problems of the world. So they wanted out. And he let them think they got there. Except, and then you'll see later when you read the Lotus Sutra on kings, like Shariputra, you know, the main disciple who's very much important in the Vimalakirti, he at one point kind of runs away when Buddha is teaching the Lotus Sutra, that like nirvana's right here. You know? Everything is Buddha's body. He has kind of a vision he shares with people like that. And when he does, then Shariputra kind of hides, runs away. And then finally Shariputra does come back and says, you know, I thought you were the devil posing as the Buddha, Mara. I thought, when you were saying that, because you've been telling us all the time it's all suffering here and we have to get out to nirvana and no more birth, no more this, no more that. Now you're saying everything here is nirvana and it's all your golden body, all the trees, the concrete, the houses, the people, everything. So I thought you were the devil telling us a bad story. But now, okay, I think you're really Buddha, you know, poked him or something, you're really Buddha. So so I'm very puzzled, why didn't you tell us before? And then Buddha makes the famous analogy of the father with many children. It must be a king, that's a lot of children, and with different wives, and in a harem, you know. And he says that he knows the children are playing inside a house which is on fire. And he knows this child likes deers, and this child likes horses, and this child likes bullocks. So he says, I have horse carts for the ones who like horses, I have deer carts for the ones who like deers, I have bullock carts for the ones who like bullock carts. Then when they get out, so then they run out excitedly to play with their new carts. And the burning house, they're saved from the burning house. And then when they get out there, all Dad has is bullock carts, no deers and no horses. So then he says to Shariputra, well, would you say that was a bad thing that he did to those kids? By deceiving them when he told them he had what they wanted, when it actually wasn't what he had for them. But he had a freedom for them to go and play with at least one kind of a cart. So then Shariputra says, oh, okay, that's all right. And there are a bunch of other analogies like that that he gives about the Mahayana. Because the basic thing, what we're now looking at the Mahayana, is where you come back, and what brings you back is compassion. You know, there's a great statement of Nagarjuna, my favorite statement in a way in the literature, is this one. It's in some sutras, but it becomes particularly famous in the writing of Nagarjuna. Shunyata Karana Garbham, as sort of a description of the highest expression of reality. Shunyata Karana Garbham. And Shunyata, as you know, means zero-ness or emptiness or voidness, right? Shunyata. Karuna means compassion. And from the root of it is, karu means connects to the heart. And na is like a negative. So it's like the stopping of the pleasure of your heart, which happens when you encounter others' suffering. So that's why it's compassion. It's like empathetic. You feel the suffering of the other even though you're feeling better. So then your own personal pleasure stops because you become alert to the suffering of another. And the word garbha, actually root meaning of garbha is womb, actually. So it means emptiness, the womb of compassion. So, you know, when they go out into nirvana, the individual seeking freedom for him or herself, they come here, and in a way, this is aligned with emptiness. You know, it's the absolute. Emptiness is the absolute, in a way, and therefore, it's even a little bit encouragement in the term voidness, emptiness, zeroness. A slight encouragement in the term to think of it as an empty space somewhere, and because that's the opposite of all these differentiated things which come to bother us and to cause suffering and so forth, and we're dissatisfied about. And so he lets them have that kind of thing, but then they realize that emptiness itself is empty. So then you have the emptiness of emptiness, meaning that emptiness itself has no solidity kind of thing. It's not a thing in itself. And it's like space. You know, space is a double negation, right? Space is defined in Western philosophy, the same way as in Indian philosophy, as the absence of impenetrability. So it's the lack of obstruction of something. So it's a double negation. And so by the double negation, then you come back, and when you come back, you then become aware that you are stuck with all of the differentiated things, supposedly. And so when you understand that, and you understand what I would call absolute relativity, in a sense. But it isn't quite just the same as being resigned to relativity and thinking there was a nice absolute that you can't reach. It's rather kind of where relativity itself is the absolute. So then if the relativity itself is the absolute, then the condition of the relativity that you're associated with becomes of absolute concern for you. And then what does that mean? If you're there in a relativity, in a relationality with all sensitive beings, what is of absolute importance then is that no one feel pain, that no one suffer. So then you're committed to, even if people are feeling pain, that something, whatever it is that makes them feel a little less becomes, you could put the same energy toward that as you would if you thought there was an absolute escape, that you would totally run for it, if you follow me. So it double puts you in a double bind. So therefore, this emptiness, instead of thought of as a vast space, is an emptiness like a womb, a nurturing emptiness. And what it nurtures is the mental strength to have compassion for beings and to re-engage with the relative world in a completely committed manner, so to speak. And then supposedly, this is where it gets really hard to swallow for people like me. Supposedly then, when you sort of know that this relativity is emptiness, meaning it is absolute, then you have, you can bear having a kind of empathy for everyone. You can bear what seems to be impossible otherwise. You feel that as a kind of bliss. Now, when people meditatively, they reach these stages. Remember the descriptions in the Pali Suttas. You know, you have the four immeasurables before you get to the formless. At the high level of what's called the form realm, you have the four immeasurables, which are love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, remember? Which are then divided for the deities in them into 16 heaven planes, which we didn't elaborate, but they are different names. And there are different kinds of bliss that you have, although that bliss kind of balances out here into a kind of equanimity. But still, the general progression because in order to go into these places, one has to overcome a fear of nothingness, and one has to kind of let go. And you know, you're meditating, but you kind of let go of feeling. There are moments where you might feel fear. Oh, gosh, it seems like I'm losing. Who am I? I don't know. You know, you're letting go of your sense of structure. That's really holds you. You know, that you're held in a certain fixed structure. You have to let go of that. You don't have to let go of it by saying, I have to let go of it. You couldn't do it if you said yourself like that. But what you do is you critically look at that kind of structure, and you see that it's changeable, it's mutable. It isn't a fixed thing. It's kind of a constant construction. You know, it's like, one thinks of Atlas holding up the planet. I always think, of course, when I think of that, I think of 51st Street and 5th Avenue, in front of where we used to go get visas. You remember that? Yeah. The visa office was in there. And you have that figure, Atlas holding the planet, but it's just a skeleton of the planet. So, we hold up our world all the time, and it's strenuous, and we're exhausted when we've done it for 15, 16 hours, so we want to go to sleep and pass out. And then we let go of it. When you fall asleep, you let go of it. And there you let go of it completely, and you go totally unconscious, and you lose track of any boundary between yourself and the environment, although you've created a safe environment for yourself to sleep in if you're lucky and you're not homeless. And you're happy for that giving up of holding the world structure, all of it, totally. You like to do it. It gives you a release. It's a kind of feeling of release. So these meditative states are huge release also. That's why they think that must be nirvana. Being blown away. I've been blown away. And they have a nihilistic understanding of nirvana. And they still think that nirvana has a self, something like that. And so that's myself there in nirvana. And then Buddha says annoyingly, oh no, there's no self in nirvana. Nirvana is knowing that there's no self. No fixed, separated self. So there's also therefore no fixed, separated, selfish state. Selfishness would be logical if there was a state the self could reach that was apart from everything else. Then it would be logical to be ultimately selfish. Forget you guys. Goodbye. I'm just going to go bliss out, and I'm not going to be bothered for eternity. Really effective annihilation. And of course, this is in a context, a cultural and social context, where most people were more sensible than modern materialists. But modern materialists, after all, you have to understand, and I imagine some of you Natsai majors might be, and even humanities majors are, without consciously necessarily realizing it. And it is, the idea that you're going to be nothing by dying means that there's an ultimate non-consciousness is the state. And that's a release. It's like an anesthetic. Look at these guys in West Virginia, with their opioid thing. Opium is this useless thing. It doesn't provide a single kind of anything. The only pleasure is the pleasure of going unconscious, basically, and becoming numb and anesthetized. Right? So why do so many people like that? Because they're tired and sick and tired of struggling with life, and that they don't want to really commit suicide, so they shoot up, and they ruin their health, and then they will die. And then they're passing out. I saw this program in West Virginia. They're like collapsing on the street. All these people, like they're not yogis. They're not monks and nuns, but they're like passing out in some really quick way and really sad, really terrible. Of course, somebody's making billions on selling them the crap and proscribing it for them, which is, of course, a commentary on something. So, so this is what happens. So it's this. So emptiness, instead of being that dark space, is a womb, nurturing womb, and what it nurtures is compassion. And this is the essence of what we're talking about with the emergence of Mahayana. And from the point of view of the Mahayana people themselves, many hundreds of millions of them over thousands of years, they think that the Buddha himself initially had this understanding. But then they have this Socratic idea about Buddha as a teacher to teach skillfully what people really need to learn, to open themselves to be more connected with the world in a more favorable and positive way. And starting with, for example, presenting the world as not dominated by fearful gods who are going to punish you if you don't do what they say, and to whom you have to sacrifice things, even animals, even initially in ancient period people. But its dominant force is a compassionate beings who didn't create them even, so can't be blamed for their suffering, but who can help them. Buddha never claims omnipotence. In any form of Buddhism, there's no claim of that. But there is a claim of, you could say, omnicompetence, of dealing with the situation for the benefit of beings. And therefore, the emergence of the Mahayana, in their own literature, they say, Buddha said, I don't want that coming out right away, although I'm teaching a small circle of people. I want the text to be taken away by the dragons and hidden, which might mean the merchant class, actually, I personally think, but who knows? Maybe there were some particular dragons who were into collecting manuscripts, I don't know. But he says, I'll take it away and hide them, and in 400 years, someone with the help of the dragons, by which he meant Nagarjuna, that's what that means. Nagarjuna means one who accomplished their aim with the help of the Nagas. And they will bring them up and they will spread them in the country here. But before that, I don't want them. And then we ask, well, why would that be? Well, you're dealing with a monistic situation where the individual is not much importance. So if you have the non-dualist idea that this is nirvana, then that would give the authority a kind of leverage to just keep on with the monism, or you're just part of a mechanism and you just have to be there for everybody else, and these are your duties, and you just stay and do it. And none of this dropping out and educating yourself and becoming unique as an individual and finding your own unique liberation. Forget about that. You just stick here and just do your duty. You stay in the house, you bear the children, you cook the food, you plant the things, you fight the wars, whatever you have to do. So the monistic society, first, he had to introduce skillfully dualism to create the Swiss cheese holes where people could drop out into, you call it. The legacy of which, for example, this university is a legacy of that in the West, even without the involvement of Buddhism, at least as far as we know. The Christianity really became more important in Europe and so forth through monasticism. And monasticism was the Swiss cheesification of Europe in a certain sense, in that, in the middle of all the wars and the nights and the horrible mess that you can find in any kind of PBS movie about any kind of history, there were some people who could go and drop out, and supposedly they'd be safe there, and then they could unfold their inner thing, and of course they would paint some miniatures, or they would tend some orchards, or they would do things in the West to justify their existence, and actually they would accumulate huge wealth, which is probably the real reason that Henry VIII and the Northern European princes decided that Luther had a good thing going, and they would go around and shut down all the monasteries. By shutting down all the monasteries in the Reformation centuries, it's not just because they were all gripped by the Bible, those people. It was because they wanted the wealth that had been accumulated in the monasteries for centuries. Fantastic, wealth of land, especially land also, and well-cultivated land, and barrels of champagne. And so they did that, and then actually Europe without the control of monasticism, creating population control by dropping certain percentage of people out of the gene pool, out of the rebirth, the birth pool, then the population built up, and the pressures in Europe built up to such an extent that they sent everybody out everywhere to conquer everything. And actually they conquered the whole planet, actually. sooner or later, all those guys. So that's a little bit digression, I realize that. What's happening here though, therefore, so therefore instead of considering the Mahayana the result of a process of deterioration, now the Brits who started translating the Buddhist text, they definitely considered it a product of deterioration, because the ones who were interested in Buddhism, were ones who were not, missionary fanatics, first of all, because otherwise nothing any of these natives could do would be anything decent. They had all been converted to be saved by Christ. But the others wanted to be secular themselves, so they were delighted to find some people who had something that looked like a religion, and yet they didn't believe in God. And they talked about Nirvana, which sounded like materialist nothingness to them, to the Brits. And so they liked those monks. They were sort of nice, clean. They were clean, Socrates-like people. And all these guys at Oxford and everything had been reading Plato like mad. And so they were all Socrates-type people. And they didn't really believe in any sort of anything. They just were trying to get out of an unpleasant world. And they pacified the Indian country so it was easy to conquer, actually, which was also nice. So they were kind of liked it. And then when suddenly in the Mahayana they discovered, well, they had all this cosmic stuff. And it's a complicated issue of non-dualism and compassion and competing with Christianity actually very effectively in China and Japan, for example, where it was functioning. They naturally assumed this was some sort of deterioration. And then of course the final stage of deterioration we'll come to in a few weeks was then the esoteric teachings of Tantra, where you then had multi-armed deities, you had female deities, goddesses, you had like sexual union, father-mother deities. I'll never forget at Amherst College once I was teaching a class with a friend of mine, two friends of mine, and one was a female theologian who was into God the Mother, which is the thing in female theologians are into. They're tired of this patriarchal God idea. And she was teaching about that. And then he was teaching about the great awakening of 1830s and 40s, where people really got, revivals of Christianity, very intense in the U.S. And so then each one was talking there, this kind of seminar you would have in a little college like that. And so we, with 3 faculty members, and then we had that luxury. And then we so he was showing images, of Jesus and God and so forth, and then she was showing sort of whatever female images you can find in the Abrahamic religions, and she was emphasizing them. And then it was my turn, and then I was showing different Buddhas and then finally the tantric ones, when you have male, female in union, as a sacred image, a male and a female in a yogic embrace. And then he was a big psychoanalyst guy, that historian. His name was also Bob. And so he just had a flip out in that class, and he said, "Oh my God, what kind of culture is that? Where you would have worshipped God as the primal scene." Some of you may not know that, that's a Freudian term for, when little Johnny or little Joanna goes in the bedroom and mom and dad are getting it on, and then they have a freak out, and then years later they become hysterical, they go to the shrink, and then the shrink tells them, well, it's all right. It wasn't the end of the world, and you don't have to worry about it. It's a Freudian thing, that's the primal scene. And so he says that, and I was so shocked, I never thought anybody would see it like that. But I did. I came up with something, or my unconscious did. I said, oh, Bob, I don't know. Maybe a grown-up culture. What do you think? Like that. So anyway, I'm just telling this. And the other motive is, one of my graduate students told me this 5 years ago, that the rhetoric of the empire, the British Empire, had to be, and I think before British, even the Spaniards, the rhetoric of any colonialist, racist, genociding, invading group has to have a rhetoric of how what they're invading and who they're exterminating is inferior to them, and they, really terrible. And then if, by any chance, those people happen to have big, beautiful cities, extraordinary art, amazing, artifacts, then that meant maybe in their ancient time they were cool, they had something going, but then they degenerated, they deteriorated. And according to that grad student, she traced the influence of Gibbon, you know, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the story of how he wrote that is, you may not know, it's very interesting. He was at Oxford, I think, or Cambridge, Oxbridge, and he converted to Catholicism while he was there, and his parents were so mad that they sent him to Geneva and rented a house next to where Calvin had lived, and made him like write about how the Romans went down the drain because they became effeminate and they became like civilized and cultured and so on. So that, and then, you know, associated that with the Roman Church, you know, the satanic Roman Church, as far as the really radical Protestant goes. And she traced that rhetoric into the rhetoric about wherever they conquered was some definite place. And that's why, you know, people in African history, you never hear about the Benin Kingdom and the bronze casting and etc. You just think they're all in the jungle, you know. And in the case of India, and even only 50 years ago when I started teaching, as I said to you before, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to, I'm underlining it because it should be interesting to you in our comparative study, and that is that the anthropology people and the sociologists of religion still had the idea that the non-Western people, what they call non-Western people, even if they had huge civilizations and big cities and, you know, a lot of accomplishments, they still didn't have a sense of individual self-identity. This only occurred, and even their own past, even, you know, they have all these studies of biographies, and, well, gee whiz, Augustine wrote an autobiography back in Rome, so there's a little trickle in the West. But otherwise, even the medieval period, nobody, until the Reformation, nobody even thought they were there. You know, they didn't know, they were just part of their tribe or something, you know. And of course, the people of Borneo and the Native Americans that we wasted and everything, they were just tribal people. They didn't know that they personally existed and had a personal identity. They didn't identify with themselves. They were just a part of their social position. So they actually, until very recently, that was taught. So now, you know, America first, where it is nowadays, that's just because that's part of the stupid parochial education that we people get in America still. When they get any education at all, it's a very parochial kind of stupid thing. Okay, so coming back, bringing this back to bear on this Mahayana thing. So the key, therefore, in India was that India, from something interesting, and they associated that with Buddhism rather than Vedism, or some of them liked the Vedas though, but still something more glorious past, when they defeated Alexander the Great, when they were not invaded by the Persians. But then it became just hopeless and just terrible. And therefore we have, like Rudyard Kipling, white man's burden, you know, to clean it up, to make them good Protestants, to make them like nice and violent, have some armies, work in our army, be what did they call it? I forgot what they called the Sikh troops and the different people they had in their army. They had an expression for it. But that became a natural thing. And so, and of course, being Asians and not Brits, they don't know anything about history, they don't even know what happened to them, they're just completely confused. So we're now going to figure out what really went on by our history. But, you know, these things, for example, about texts arose in such and such a century, which you read in the history books there, they are based, there's no sense of date in India at all. And in India, people didn't print books. They had a lot of free labor, they had a lot of scribes. They wrote things on palm leaf manuscripts very beautifully. And but the climate was such that those manuscripts deteriorated every few generations, so they rewrite them. So they have no idea, really, the dating of anything. But the only thing they do is whenever they're translated into Chinese, they then allow 150 years before it was translated on a total random thing of the very few people who come from China or who went to China or through Central Asia or by boat. And they say, well, then that book dates 150 years before it was translated into Chinese, which is just totally arbitrary. So they really do not know historically. And they totally, of course, did not respect the people that they conquered. And they assumed that when you conquer somebody, that the guy you conquered was inferior to you. You couldn't imagine they're more civilized to you than you, than their society was. You couldn't imagine. And that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for the day when the people who lost in the colonial 500-year period are considered superior to the people who won, who are a bunch of bullies. I'm waiting for that. And we're kind of having a sense of ourselves as potential bullies nowadays, I think, aren't we? Because of our leader. If we don't just think it was some fluke, we realize there's something in our culture that puts a person like that in a position of threatening the whole everybody in the world. I'm gonna obliterate you. You don't give me a hotel with my name on it. You know? I'm sorry. I know that's a digression. I'm sorry. I help with that. So now we come to the Vimalakirti Sutra of these. So that's the main thing. It's this new non-dual idea of compassion as equally valuable as wisdom, or really as compassion as the main product of the wisdom. But then again, compassion, don't think that compassion is a kind of acceptance of suffering. You know, so don't think the difference between the individual vehicle and the universal vehicle is that the universal one says, okay, we're all going to suffer, so we'll just come back from some supposed nirvana apart from things and just hang out with you and suffer to get along with you. That's not the case. It still is a liberation from suffering, absolutely. But this liberation is conducted with others. Why? Why would you have compassion for someone who is suffering if you were equally suffering? But you might have a notional compassion, actually. You'd say, well, gee, I hate this feeling, and then, so, you know, I'm sure they hate theirs. It would be something notional like that. But you would have, in a way, no energy to do anything about their suffering if you were equally miserable. You know, because you're dealing with your own problem. I have enough problems myself. You know? So it would be, your compassion would just be what they call, it's in Vimalakirti, this concept, notional compassion. An idea that I should be compassionate, or kind of pity, because you're as bad off as me. So an effective, powerful compassion, like an effective, powerful love, is when you, based on the person who is the lover or the compassioner, I don't know, we don't have a word like that, but feeling better. You know, that the one who realized this emptiness, who realized the deeper nature of reality, is able to be in this situation in a way where they have a kind of bliss, a kind of inner energy themselves, the inner contentment that the Buddha talked about to that prince, remember the king Ajatasattu, when he talked about the different fruits of the homeless life, remember in that wonderful archetypal sutra. And you know, it gets better and nicer, and you end up looking at a cool mountain stream with the pebbles in the stream, you know. Which again is not a symbol of being disappeared from differentiation. It is a way of calmly interacting with differentiation. To see it as at the bottom of a crystal clear pond, you know, it gives you an image like that. So it's a little more complex, in other words. You know, bliss in a way is the source energy of true love and true compassion. Because once you feel that, you realize it's possible for the other one, and so you want them to have it themselves. And it sort of naturally overflows. So it has true joy wants a companion. I think I read an expression in some Western mystics, I think recently. True joy wishes a companion. And the one who is like, I'm so miserable, but I love you, that's not really going to be compassionately effective to the person who is beloved. Okay. Unless they're very compassionate themselves, they're going to really recoil from that. You know? So if love is defined as it is in Buddhism, Maitri, the word Maitri, love, as the will to the happiness of the beloved, then there has to be some idea of happiness in the willer for it to have any validity, in a way, something like that. Okay? So that's important. So now let's look at the Vimalakirti itself. So first of all, it's one inconceivability after another. Oh yeah, in the Vimalakirti, I wanted to say this. Now, the reason I use the Vimalakirti in our courses, and actually it's very widely used in college courses around the country, I have to say. And the reason is that it's like an anthology of all the Mahayana Sutras. The Mahayana Sutras are said to be like an ocean, and of course probably many are lost, but there's huge numbers of them. It's like 100 Bibles or something, the Mahayana Sutras. And there are at least 6 categories of them. And since I don't have a slide up there, I have to kind of draw something. And first, it's what's called Pure Land Sutras. The Pure Land. And we'll read little snatches from these in the next couple of weeks. And nowadays, the biggest school in Japan, for example, and China, but it's suppressed in China, of course, but in free China, like Taiwan and so forth, and it's underground, very powerful in PRC China as well. Underground is Pure Land. And that one is like a version of kind of Happy Hunting Ground. It's like where Buddha Amitabha, automatically, if anybody knows Amitabha's name, when they die, they say Amitabha, and then they go there. Their subtle dream-like between-state body goes there. and is installed there on a lotus and is in the presence of the Buddha of infinite light, you know, but they think forever, actually, in the simplistic version of the Pure Land. But actually, until they get brave enough to go back out and develop their own compassion in the world. So there's the Pure Land Sutras. And in the Vimalakirti, you have like hints of the Pure Land Sutra in the first chapter, in the 8th chapter, and the 12th chapter, where you talk about these kind of celestial like paradise worlds, but where you develop your samadhi and you develop your wisdom and compassion. But although it's hard to develop your compassion, because you're very remote, suffering is very, very remote in those realms. Then the second one are the Transcendent Wisdom Sutras, by Paramita. Transcendent Wisdom Sutras, which is the emphasis on emptiness and selflessness and this sort of thing, on and on, Shunyata, everything is empty, 5, 6, 7, everything is empty. And that's a huge category of sutras, of Mahayana sutras. There are 18 of them. The longest is 100,000 lines. The shortest is 1 syllable. And we can have a quiz as to what syllable do you think it is. Then the third one is called the Buddha Garland Sutra, or the Buddha Avatamsaka Sutra. So, but I will give the name that the translator of it, one version of it, into Chinese gave to it. Wonderful translator of my generation. Best translator from Chinese and Japanese of my generation. The Flower Ornament Sutra. And the Flower Ornament Sutra is this mutual interpenetrability of everything. It actually teaches what's called a holographic vision of reality. That every atom contains the whole universe, and that each atom is unique in the universe. And I'll talk about it later. I'm just giving a rundown. Then there's the Ratnakuta, the Jewel Heap Sutra. Jewel Heap. Oh yeah, and this is chapters in Vimalakirti 5 and 9. You know, this is 1, 8, and 12. And the flower ornament is 6, and then everywhere else throughout chapter 6 and 2 other places. And then the Jewel Heap. Jewel Heap Sutra is where a lot of lay people get involved. And they start teaching, and also some young ladies and things, and they turn out to be wiser than the monks, and they tell the monks where it's at, etc. And so there's sort of, it's like social surprise that there are these people who seem to be ordinary people, and yet they're more enlightened even than the monks. So that's the central theme in the Jewel Heap Sutra. But there are 51 of them, that's a lot of sutras. And then the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra category, and that's where, instead of Pure Land being somewhere else, like a heavenly thing, this place itself is like actually a Pure Land. And I think I don't need 7. This place is a Pure Land, if you know what it's like, you know. And the Lotus Sutra, and actually the Mahayana version of the Parinirvana Sutra, that is the thorough or total Nirvana Sutra. People wrongly translate Parinirvana as final Nirvana, because they think Buddha dies. But actually, the word doesn't mean final. The prefix in front of nirvana, pari means thorough or complete nirvana, meaning that by sort of setting aside that body, the Buddha teaches that he's everywhere, something like that, in the Mahayana understanding. And then finally, that Lotus Sutra is the house of Vimalakirti, actually. Vimalakirti's house. You know, as of like that magical house, you know, the feast chapter, and you know, things where Vimalakirti is insisting that this is Shakyamuni Buddha's Pure Land, and in the feast where he tells the Bodhisattvas who come from the incense universe that this is a better land because there seems to be more suffering here, and this therefore people develop their compassion here, whereas in a Pure Land they develop their wisdom, yes, but there's very little chance to develop compassion because they're not nearby any suffering people. And they get bored. And all those incense bodhisattvas come to, well, you haven't read that chapter yet, you read 1 to 5 of this week, but anyway, that's there. And 6 is the Tantra, the esoteric one. Tantra, and the Tantra, he mentions in the Vimalakirti's house, in the goddess chapter, and then this confusing chapter 8, in my version of the chapter, which is called the family of the Tathagata. So in that sense, Vimalakirti is an anthology, and you get a taste of all of these, which are, you know, huge volumes, many volumes, some of them. The long Prajnaparamita Sutra in Tibetan in its Tibetan translation is something like 8 volumes or something, 400 or 500 page volume. So endlessly emptiness, 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 you know, all about in that. Okay, so now Vimalakirti, to look at it specifically in the text, as a form of text. So I think that's the main points I wanted to make, and then we come to the actual text. Now this is an odd thing. I remember now, the reason I translated this, now the Tibetans, I have to say, they don't actually read sutras in their normal study. They read these what are called shastras, or you know, teaching manuals, you could say, or scientifically organized teaching manuals that sort of give you a graded way of understanding, sort of lead you into the understanding. The reason they don't, and they read the sutras at high speed as a blessing or just, you know, for fun, but they don't think they can sort of learn easily from the sutras, because although they quote them and what they teach in the manuals are drawn from them, and then the Tibetan writers could draw from the manuals and from the sutras, so they quote them. But they don't really read them for study because they feel these sutras record the Buddha teaching individuals in his era. And they actually think of his era, the individuals there, as more advanced than they are. And therefore they feel that it wasn't aimed at me, and so I can't necessarily understand that. So I need a sort of gradual way of understanding it. And so when I was commissioned by someone to translate this sutra, I was very puzzled in the first chapter. At the very beginning of the sutra, the Buddha is, he's living there, and he goes to this place. He goes to the garden of the equivalent of a diva, you know, like a great actress or a movie star in our day. And he's living in the garden there with his 1,200 monks. And the mayors of the big city, Vaishali, where they are the high people, are very angry because they wanted to invite him to be in the mayor's mansion or next to the mayor's mansion, and then they would go for teachings or something, you know, he'd be honored as a dignitary. And instead of that, he had the practice that whoever, when he would go to a city or near a city or a village, whoever first would invite him and the monks, he would accept that invitation. And she had a better chariot than they did. So she got to the Buddha first and invited him. So he said, okay, we'll go to your garden. And she had a big grove, you know, she was very wealthy. And Amrapali was her name. And so they were there. And then the older one said, oh, that guy, he's hanging out with like a celebrity. We're not going there. He must be something wrong with him. But the young people went there because they thought, oh, that's interesting. And so they went to, they'd already been studying, and they were already practicing something, they say, when they get there. And so 500 of them, various yuppies, they come out to see the Buddha, all carrying these jeweled parasols, right? So then, thereupon the Lichavi Bodhisattva Ratnakala with 500 Lichavi youths, each holding a precious parasol, made of 7 different kinds of jewels, came forth from the city of Vaishali and presented himself at the grove of Amrapali. Each approached the Buddha, bowed at his feet, circumambulated him clockwise 7 times, that's really strenuous, laid down his or her precious parasol, an offering, and withdrew to one side. So that's very, and then you have a big pile of 500 parasols, jeweled parasols, like this kind of beautiful little sun umbrellas. As soon as all these precious parasols had been laid down, suddenly, by the miraculous power of the Blessed Lord, they were transformed into a single precious canopy, so great that it formed a covering for this entire billion-world galaxy. The surface of the entire billion-world galaxy was reflected in the interior of the suns, moons, and stellar bodies, in the interior of the great precious canopy, where the total content of this galaxy could be seen. Limitless mansions of suns, moons, and stellar bodies, the realms of the gods, dragons, goblins, fairies, etc., were all seen there. And the mountains, the oceans, rivers, bays, torrents, streams, brooks, and springs. Finally, all the villages, suburbs, cities, capitals, provinces, and wildernesses. All this could be clearly seen by everyone. And the voices of all the Buddhas of the 10 directions, from other universes, that is, could be heard proclaiming their teachings of the Dharma in all the worlds, the sounds reverberating in the space beneath the great precious canopy. So when I read that passage right at the beginning of the job of translating it, I was so shocked. What is this? What is this? Do this, you know, before they come for teaching, right? But then he first does this. And then I realized it was something like a planetarium. Actually, he created a special, you know, what do you call it, what do they call it? Performance art, a piece of performance art that was like a planetarium. And so, you know, and what did you see in the planetarium? Well, you saw sort of, it was a way of seeing all of nature, all there, all interconnected with you. And of course, it had many different universes, he saw. It says, you know, and so it's a very sci-fi sort of visionary thing of you're like simultaneously seeing, instead of like Carl Sagan going out, and how many planets have they now discovered? It could be planetoid, humanoid type planets with the, you know, the planet the right distance from the sun, orbiting and all this. There's like zillions of them now. I think they found out by whatever marvelous measurement equipment they have, you know, the Hubble telescope or whatever it is. So these people are thinking that there's other universes and worlds of human beings all over the place, everywhere. They're thinking that. So they assume that the people temporarily become aware of it. So that's what he does, shows them. Then they praise him, right? They give him all these verses of praise. The young Vaishali kids, yuppies, and they sort of devotional things to the Buddha. I don't need to reread that, you read it all, but it's some of it very profound. They say, in the last one he says, you nullify all signs and all things everywhere. You are not subject to any wish for anything at all. The miraculous power of the Buddha is inconceivable. I bow to you who stand nowhere like infinite space. Well, that's a pretty perceptive way of trying to express what is a Buddha, at least in the Mahayana view. And there's all these other things, which are really quite beautiful verses in any language. And so then they ask him this question, which is a very much the Mahayana question. They say, because in the Mahayana, the idea is you bring all the beings with you into enlightenment. You take a vow as a bodhisattva, I will not go to nirvana like those arhats who want to just get themselves out. I will not accept liberation from suffering, total liberation from suffering in nirvana, until all beings are free of suffering. I will stay with all the beings forever. That's this compassion thing. And yet, I will stay with them forever as long as they suffer, but it doesn't give up the idea there is a place for everyone beyond the suffering, right? Which is kind of, it's again, that's inconceivable, that's paradoxical, because there's infinite numbers of the beings, and etc. But that's what the vow is. So the Buddha land concept is a concept of how you change the universe. For example, you know, teaching. And actually, they do think speaking and teaching by speaking is the most important type of teaching, actually. Contrary to the MOOC thing, where all the audio-visual, because you guys are not supposed to be able to concentrate longer than 8 minutes before your mind wanders and you start thinking about supper or last night or this evening, whatever it is, in your mind, and you don't get it. You have 8-minute bursts, you know, and like TED Talks, they give you 14 minutes. And then you have to shut up, or 18 minutes actually, and then you have to be quiet. Because all the Silicon Valley people who go there, they can only concentrate for 18 minutes. And I'm afraid people who grow up watching TV and commercial breaks all the time, and they iPhones and things, that they develop an interruptibility, which they think maybe is good multitasking, but maybe it's stressful actually. You never know. But anyway, they do think that teaching by talking is important. On the other hand, if you really wanted to teach, you would be like 4D. Do you know about 4D theater? Have you ever been to a 4D theater? Did I tell you about a 4D theater? I never mentioned that in this class? Oh, good. You know 3D, right? You put on the glasses and then the monster or King Kong or something is going to eat you alive, right? Or Jurassic Park, whatever it is. Right? That's 3D. But 4D is where there's and the only one I ever saw was in, I didn't actually go, but I heard about it. It was in Bangkok, actually, in Thailand. And a friend of mine went to saw a science fiction film there. 4D is where your own seat is wired into the movie. So for example, if you're on a spaceship that's crashing or buffeting, your seat starts to go like that. And in case there's like a flood or something, then the seat in front of you sprays water on you. Seriously. And that's called 4D. So, I mean, but a really good, I mean, if you had ideal teaching, in other words, the environment would be teaching. You'd be mobilizing the environment to shape it. So we would have, like right now, it would be great. I would love to have a classroom like that if I knew, it's not tech enough, but where, you know, you'd see pictures of the Buddha or the countryside where he lived or Mount Everest or whatever it was, you know. So people would be seeing that at the same time as you'd be talking about that happening. That would be ideal. That would be really great. But, and so in a way, So that's what a Buddha land is. So when you want to bring all beings into freedom and alignment with you, you make a thing that you're going to take the whole land, the whole environment, everything is going to become a Buddha place. And then it'll be the ultimate teaching environment for all beings. That's what a Buddha land really is. It's kind of presented like a heaven, a Julian place of bliss. The little duck goes by, it's a jeweled duck that's made of like diamond plasma. And the duck goes quack, but instead of quack you hear suffering, origination, suffering, nirvana, path to the origination, instead of going quack. So you can't escape it. It's actually kind of a little bit overwhelming. And but anyway, that's how Buddha lands are described. And in the one in the Vimalakirti, the chapter you didn't reach, but you will next week, there are these bodhisattvas from the incense universe, and the Buddha there doesn't talk. He just radiates a certain incense. They take a sniff and they want to samadhi. The trees are made of incense, their own bodies are made of incense, and yet they're totally bored. And Vimalakirti sends out for takeout to that universe, and then they will come back with the gopher that he sends there. And because they want to see what Vimalakirti's place is like, this weird guy who's sent out to take them. So anyway, that's what it is. And so they ask this question, they say, look, we can understand trying to perfect ourselves to become enlightened with wisdom and develop compassion, etc. That we can understand. But how can you change the world? The whole, could make a Buddha land of this mess here, you know? And the Buddha then gives this long spiel how, you know, everything in Buddha field is the purity of the path of the 10 virtues. When the Bodhisattva attains enlightenment, living beings who are secure in long life, great in wealth, chaste in conduct, enhanced by true speech, soft-spoken, free of divisive intrigues, and adroit in reconciling factions, enlightening in their conversations, free of envy, free of malice, and endowed with perfect views. That's the 10-fold path of skillful evolutionary action, by the way, will be born in his Buddha field. Thus, noble son, just as is the Bodhisattva's production of the spirit of enlightenment, so is his positive thought, and just as is his positive thought, so is his virtuous application. And he goes on with that, and he finally says, purity of his teaching reflects the purity of his transcendental practice, and the purity of his transcendental practice reflects the purity of his own mind. So that's why the Buddha field of a Buddha is pure. That's how you purify the Buddha field. And he even says, early on, actually, I should have read that. He says, for example, Ratnaka, which means jewel mind, by the way, should one wish to build in empty space, one might just go ahead in spite of the fact that it is not possible to build or to adorn anything in empty space. In just the same way, should a bodhisattva who knows full well that all things are like empty space wish to build a Buddha field in order to develop living beings, he might go ahead in spite of the fact that it is not possible to build or to adorn a Buddha field in empty space. So, so it's like you can do it, but it's impossible. So then he starts out with that. Then he gives this long spiel about how great it is. Then Shariputra, but this is so unfair to poor Shariputra, because he is a kind of enlightened in his own level. And so he wouldn't have normally thought this, but Buddha kind of telepathically plants the thought in his mind. Thereupon, magically influenced by the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra, the most venerable of the dualistic individual vehicle Buddhists, disciples of the Buddha, he says, if the Buddha field is pure only to the extent that the mind of the Bodhisattva is pure, then when Shakyamuni Buddha was engaged in the career of the Bodhisattva, his mind must have been impure. Otherwise, how could this Buddha field appear to be so impure? And then the Buddha, knowing telepathically the thought of Venerable Shariputra, well, sure he knows that he planted it. It's kind of a little unfair, but it's part of his teaching thing. He said to him, what do you think, Shariputra? Is it because the sun and moon are impure that those blind from birth do not see them? Oh no, Lord, it is not so. The fault lies with those blind from birth and not with the sun and moon. In the same way, Shariputra, the fact that some living beings, like you, do not behold the splendid display of virtues of the Buddha field of the Tathagata, the transcendent Buddha, is due to their own ignorance. It is not the fault of the Tathagata. Shariputra, the Buddha field of the Tathagata is pure, but you do not see it. Actually, pure in India, it kind of means perfect, you know. They always say pure, impure, but it's really perfect and imperfect. You could easily translate as. I sometimes do. So then Brahma Shikin, and this is kind of interesting, intriguing. Brahma Shikin means the head Brahma. And therefore, remember, that's the one in the sutta that you saw where the monk went to ask Brahma how the world was created, all this, and then Brahma basically said he didn't know. Remember that? And so this is saying Brahma. So it's basically sort of whatever level of God there is in this culture, in the Buddhist version of this culture, which is who becomes a student of the Buddha. He attends on the Buddha, and other Brahmas from other universes come with him if you go back to the beginning of the chapter. And so, as for me, O Brahma, no, so Brahma Shikin says to Shariputra, Reverend Shariputra, do not say that the Buddha feels that the Tathagata is impure. Reverend Shariputra, the Buddha feels that the Tathagata is perfect. I see the splendid expanse of the Buddha field of the Lord Shakyamuni as equal to the splendor of, for example, the abodes of the highest deities. And I didn't put, he meant the desired deities in that case, actually. I wouldn't put that there in those days, I maybe should have. But it was too complicated to explain what the highest desire around heaven is. Paranirmita Vashavartin. And because Paranirmita Vashavartin means one who controls the fantasies of others. And that is a God, kind of God who is so jaded with pleasure that they can't think of anything else that they want. So they live, but they still linger there, and they voyeuristically enjoy whatever other fantasy. And the heaven just below them is where the gods get to enjoy whatever fantasies they have as if they were real. And the ones above them, they don't have fantasies, but they voyeur on top of the fantasies of the other ones. So that's what I just put abodes of the highest deities, but it's really misleading. I should really fix that. Then the Venerable Shariputra holds his ground, and he said to Brahma Shikin, for me, O Brahma, as for me, O Brahma, I see this great earth with its highs and lows, its thorns, its precipices, its peaks, and its abysses, as if it were entirely filled with crap. Ordure, I don't know why I think that word. Forget that. Excrement, you could say. So, if you want to be like technical sounding. So Brahma Shikin replied, well, that's your problem. Your mind is full of crap, that means. He says, it means that your mind, there are highs and lows in your mind, Reverend Shariputra, and your positive thought in regard to the Buddha of Gnosis is not pure either. The Buddha of direct, intuitive wisdom. That means, in Gnosis, I use that word, those things. Reverend Shariputra, those whose minds are impartial toward all living beings, and whose positive thoughts toward the Buddha of Gnosis are pure, see this Buddha field as perfectly pure. Thereupon the Lord, and this sort of sets the puzzle of this whole sutra, touched the ground of the billion-world galactic universe with his big toe, and suddenly it was transformed into a huge mass of precious jewels, a magnificent array of many hundreds of thousands of clusters of precious gems, until it resembled the universe of the Tathagata Ratnavyuha called Anantaguna Ratnavyuha. That means the jewel array of infinite excellences. Everyone, the entire assembly was filled with wonder, each perceiving himself or herself seated on a throne of jeweled lotuses. Then the Buddha said to Shariputra, do you see the splendor of the virtues of the Buddha field? Oh, I see it, Lord. Here before me is a display of splendor such as I never before heard of or beheld. So, Shariputra, this Buddha field is always thus perfect, but the Tathagata makes it appear to be spoiled by many faults in order to bring about the maturity of inferior living beings. For example, I should say lowly living beings. For example, Shariputra, the gods of the 33 heaven, that's the Olympus heaven in India thing, 33 heavens, all take their food from a single precious vessel. Yet the nectar which nourishes each one differs according to the differences of the merits each has accumulated. That's like on Star Trek, what is it, the synthesizer, or what's that thing? You go and you get what I want, you know, Kryptonian like nectar or milkshake, right? It makes whatever you want. What's the thing called in Star Trek?
Replicator.
What?
Replicator.
Replicator, that's it. So that means it's a replicator in that heaven. And it's definitely sci-fi, you have to admit. This is thousands of years old. And so just so, Shariputra. So you all take the food, accumulated. So it differs according to the differences of the merits each has accumulated. Just so, Shariputra, living beings born in the same Buddha field, see the splendor of the virtues of the Buddha fields of the Buddhas according to their own degrees of purity. And then all these people have to flip out when they see this. They have this moment, and then what does it mean to each one perceive themselves sitting in a jeweled lotus? Well, it means that we all think, oh, I have to go to work, I have to rest, I have to go to TV, I have to go this first, oh, I have to do that. Then I'll meditate later, then I'll give a great gift later, and then I'll do some wonderful thing, and I'll save the world later. And what he's saying, when you're in the jeweled thing, that means you're in the best possible moment and situation for you to cultivate and perfect yourself as you possibly can be. Your circumstance, it's the best of all possible worlds vision, in other words, that you convey to people. And there was, but they put it in terms of jewels, you know, and because that's something precious and that is desirable by people. And then he picks up his foot, and then it looks back like the usual like mess. And then the whole argument of the whole sutra has to do with that, which it comes out explicitly when he talks to the incense bodhisattvas, as you'll see, where he says, this is a better Buddha land, Shakyamuni's Buddha land here, is better than your perfume one, because here you can develop compassion, because you're dealing with difficulties, you're challenged in a certain way, whereas there you're just too indulged in your perfume environment type of thing, you know? Although they obviously needed it when they went there, because they were too freaked out or something. But now that they are so bored that they want to go to Vimalakirti's house for lunch across the galaxy, then that means that they are ready for something else, for teaching Vimalakirti. Okay, see you on Thursday.
Okay.
Oh,